We're up to page. We finished Perek Reish Tzadik 290. Chapter 291 is the end of the Maimer, so which is really answering the questions on Ekev. We'll move right on to Perek Reish Tzadik base 292 on page 590. However, I think it's important to at least sum up what we learned last class because it's quite dense. So I think a good way to put the whole context in the middle of the discussion of the difference between the inner container and the outer container as they relate to the energy. And the point being that the inner container is the most conducive and is the primary place where container meets light, where container meets energy. That was the underlying premise and theme. Because all this is obviously critical to the interface and how the interface works. In explaining this, the Rabbi Rashab first began with the difference between descriptive names, Shema Toyar, Shema Etzem, and a functional name, Shema Pu'ula, where one describes the container itself, one describes the energy itself, that's the inner container, and the other describes its function, which is its outer expression. And from there, he moved into the difference between Tzelem and Mus, which essentially is the same idea, but of course on a more sublime level, and also more relevant in a way to the human structure, because we are created in the image of God, and that image is described in two ways, Tzelem and Mus. So you see how grounded the inner container and outer container is posted in a pasuk. So when you read the Torah, it says human beings created in the divine image. It doesn't say image, it says Tzelem and Mus, image and what do we say? A shape. However you tie the words. But what is Tzelem and Mus? So Tzelem and Mus essentially, Rabbi Rashab breaks into many details, but in the picture of the context, it's essentially the outer container, the inner container and the outer container. But to explain that, explains it in more detail. First he begins and says Tzelem is the energy itself. We're talking all Natsilis, of course. Remember, as soon as you say Adam, you're talking about Adam Elyon, the supernal man. That's you say Tzir Adam, how the divine manifests through the Kriyach HaGvul, and after the Tzimtzum in the shape and form of an Adam, the Tzelem and Mus of Elikus is Atzilus always. So the Adam consists of Tzelem and Mus, and the first step he says Tzelem is the Oyer. What is Oyer? Oyer describes and is in the image of the divine, its reflection of it. And the Mus goes on the containers. That's the first interpretation. When I say first, it's gradations of the same idea. That's in chapter Reish Peites 289. And what's the difference between Tzelem and Mus in this context? One is the Tzura, and one is the Tzura of the Tzura. What does that mean? One is the Tzura Atzmis, as he calls it. Later he gives the example of the seal and the wax. So one is the image of the seal within the seal. And then there's a copy of that that's transposed on the wax. So that's a copy of the original seal. He doesn't use that example just for the record when he talks about Eris and Kalim. He talks about that in Kalim itself. But nevertheless, he does use the expression that Tzelem is Tzura Atzmis. So as soon as something is not the etzem, not the essence, when you say sunlight, or you say the divine light, or the divine energy, that energy is already out of the essence, so it's some form of shape. But then, there's the second level, where that, where it comes to Tzura, from the Tzura, that's the containers. And like an example that he gave is the colors in the light. So the light itself is like pure white. What about when the color goes through the prism? So it creates the rainbow, the spectrum of colors. So that's also in the light, but that's already the kelim, the container level. But remember, always is a reflection of its source, and container is always a reflection of identity of the substance of what we're dealing with. So even the inner containers are still already, they have definitely more shape and form than the energy does. And then he goes on, the second half of that chapter says, then the truth is, Tzelem and Mus are both in the container. And it's going to be the outer and inner container, the inner and outer container. And here he gives the example of the seal and the wax.
You mean in truth or in another way?
Well, he calls it the emes. The words are
the other one was
Amram kolosin natsir ikrehu b'chinas
So the other view was not true.
No, and the word true is not a good expression. I just used it. No, here he actually says. Later he says emes. Here he says the language is Amram kolosin natsir v'atmoni ikrehu b'chinas hakelim. I'm going to explain this relativity in a moment. I just want to go through the levels here. It explains that they're both in the container, and this we're talking about now is the seal and the wax. And in that itself, he explains two ways. One is that in the seal is engraved images, so it's in the etzem, but it's only a gilim in the etzem. It's only a revelation from the etzem, from the essence. And then there's that how the essence actually is just expressed in the image. You know, we talked the difference between two ways someone can convey a message. They can come and give you the message and they focus on the message, or that person itself is a reflection of the messenger, like a real shliach, let's say. So, he says that one is really referring to the levels before Atzilus. If it's like more, and fundamentally that's really Torah mitzvahs. Torah mitzvahs have a shape and form. There's details and there's so on, but they are the expression of the essence in the shape and form that Hashem wants, that God wants us to follow. And in Atzilus, it's the Gilim Mina Etzem. It's still engraved within the source, but it's not the source as is expressed in shape and form. But that's relevant because then he goes to the next chapter and establishes that containers are really a interface between the written letters and the engraved letters. And of course, he begins with a question that hypothetically, seemingly, containers are not like you said that's engraved like the seal. Truth is, containers are davar nesef; they're an additional element. Oyer is really more in the seal. In other words, like the general interpretation of Tzelem and Mus. So he explains in this chapter, the last chapter, we learned that the containers have in themselves a property that's similar to engraved, and a property that's similar to the written letter. And it's not completely davar nesef. And the first thing he says in the parentheses is that it's like the two levels in engraved itself. There's how the etzem gets engraved in letters, that would be true engraving. And there's how the etzem is only, that the letters are engraved in the essence, that's already how the containers are. So it's a form of engraving, but it's not complete one with the essence, so to speak. And to explain this, he goes into the idea that Atzilus is the level of thought. The level of thought. And thought has letters. They're not like letters of speech. In letters of speech, it is an additional element. Once the letters are expressed in tangible, concrete way, they're outside of the essence. But as long as they're still in your thought process, the letters are there, but they're like engraved. But as I said, it's not the deepest level of engraving. Think of it like he's essentially expressing a new level of engraved letters. Something that's engraved, but not as engraved as the deeper level of engraving. And then he says, Yesh Mizeh, and even more than this. And this becomes a whole explanation of the Tikkun Zayar that says that the Esser spheres of Atzilus is a image of the king himself, of God. The kelim of Bria is the seal, and Yetzirah is the wax. So, what's the Yesem Mizeh? What's Yesem Mizeh? Yesem Mizeh is because now, in essence, it's really coming from the Zohar. Seemingly, everything comes down at a lower level. Because till now we're talking Atzilus is the wax and the seal, the inner and outer container. It doesn't say yet outer container, but it's talking about the containers or the light of Atzilus. Now it's all moves downward. So seemingly there's a question here. So what is Tzelem and what is Dmus? Till now we were talking Tzelem and Dmus. First was Eirus, then Kelim. Then we said in Kelim itself they're both there. Now he's saying it's not even Eirus and Kelim. We're talking now in Bria. He says that from this Mashma said the Bria B'chinas Tzalmenu, because the Bria is, according to the Tikkun Zohar, Bria is the seal, and the seal is the Tzelem. The wax is the Mus. And he says even Atzilus in Bria, I'm sorry, but in other places it's Mashma that Bria is the Mus, and Atzilus is Tzelem. Even the Atzilus within Bria and Bia is also the Mus. So you have somewhat of a contradiction here. And what he explains, of course, is 2 points. One is that we're talking here everything within Atzilus, Bria within Atzilus, Yitzir within Atzilus. That sounded quantum-like.
Go into the corner.
So, what you have here is number one. Number two is that this is what he understood with the whole difference between the outer and inner containers. But then he's going to give another explanation that's talking about Biyah outside of Atzilus. So I'll sum it up in a moment. So we're going to have here like 4 different ways that Tzelem and Dmus are explained. That's what it comes down to. So what's the explanation here? The Pnimi Sakelim and Chitzeni Sakelim. Just for the record, in the beginning of Tav Kuf Pezayin, he says, explained earlier in chapter 285, that there are 3 levels of the Kelim. I looked through that chapter 20 times, and it only talks about 2 levels of Kelim. And here he's referred to 3. Reish Teich Seif, and there it doesn't even make any mention of it. So I'm just making a footnote that it's important to look into. I mean, technically you could say that he meant to say that there. That really there are 3. There's the outer, the inner, and the emtza, the teich. But technically in page 285, chapter 285, Reish Peh, he doesn't mention it all the 3, even though he says in his Barlir that there's 3, Reish Teich Seif. He only talks about the 2. So what do we have here? So here's the explanation. In Atzilus itself, you have Atzilus Atzilus would be Chochmah. Chochmah, as we've learned, is really higher than containers. It's really the Oyer. It also has a container, but the container of Chochmah is like on the level of Oyer. Here he just refers to it in the parentheses. So that would be the first level of Tikkun Zohar, the image of the divine. That's Chochmah, like he says in the parentheses. And Atzmis HaChochmah is even higher than that. Fine. Then comes Bina. Bina in Atzilus is Bria Shabatzilus. That's where you have, Chochmah Mekana because Chochmah Mekana Batzilus. Bina is Mekana Bebria because Saya. So remember, in the whole context of things, everything is microcosm, macrocosm, like a hologram. So everything is within everything. So in Atzilus you have Bria, Atzilus, Bria, Yitzir, Asiya. So the Atzilus of Atzilus is Chochmah. The Bria of Atzilus is Bina, and Bina already now begins the Kelim. This is the seal. So it's the seal. It's the inner containers. And then comes the next level, the outer container, and that's Yitzira of Atzilus. And that's like the wax, the shape from the shape.
And that corresponds to what in Atzilus? We got Chochmah.
Zah. And Malchus would be Asiya, which he really doesn't discuss yet. I mean, he hints to it, and I'll explain in a moment what he says. Mm-hmm. And now to explain this, he says, back based on what we just said, Atzilus is Machshava. So where do you have Machshava more than one level? So he says there's 2 levels of Machshava. is when you, the Eisis Machshava, where you're not thinking about speaking to someone yet. It's just an abstract idea. That also has to have containers. There's some, as soon as you have the conscious process of thought, it already is shape and form. So there's already some form of tzelem there. And then there's machshava, that you're preparing to actually say something to another person. And you're actually saying words in your mind. You're saying, you're formulating actual letters and words. And that's the outer container.
So the first level is makor and machshava?
Not makor necessarily. Machshava itself. It says in machshava itself. There's you could think of an idea, and it's not about expressing it to someone else. That also has a form of expression to yourself. And then you're actually thinking how to speak to someone. It says that's specific. The whole thought is, how am I going to say it to someone?
It's just organized. At that level, it's organized.
Not necessarily. But you're ready. You can actually visualize and formulated words. Like you said, like you memorized to yourself. I'm going to start off and saying hello, everyone. You're saying the words hello, everyone in your mind. In the first one, you're not relating to another. You may never even express those inner thoughts. It's a different level. What?
The way he explains it now, he's talking about or being completely pushed, like.
Well, so let me finish, and I'm gonna go back to it in a moment. I wanted to organize it because it was very, so many things going on. And he explains, so the kav, the ray of light that comes after the tzimtzum, where does it really manifest? Where does it end? It ends in Atzilus. So in Atzilus you have these two levels. Now here he alludes to the three levels of containers. Maybe you could say, I'm not saying for sure, but maybe you could say, if Chochmah is the level of what he calls the Yukna de Malka Mamash. And Bina, or Bria, in Atzilus, is the level of the inner container. And Yetzirah is the wax. Bina being, in other words, the seal. Yetzirah is the wax. How you're thinking what you're going to say to someone. Then he alludes to that there's a level that you're thinking how you're going to do something. So maybe that's Asiyah Sheba Atzilus, which would be Malchus of Atzilus. So you really have four levels here. Bria, Yetzirah, Atzilus, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiyah. But this he alludes to maybe in that line where he says that begin madregas because primus agam kamisha cheshev seichel atzmis shemur geshtaka erle esis and beginners am tzoy v'chetzeni shal hakelim, which is the musenu. That's al darach moshe cheshev eich l'daber ve'eich lases. So I'm thinking that am tzoy v'chetzeni is the eich l'daber is the middle container, and Echlasis, how to do, would be the outer. But the bottom line is now, so what we have is as follows. Atzilus within Atzilus Chochmah is not yet even a level of Tzelem. That's the level of Yukna de Malka Mamish. The level of Tzalmenu, the Musenu, starts in Kalim, according to this explanation here. So the Pnimis HaKalim, which would be Bina or Bria, is what they says Bria. That's what he means by Bria. There you have is the seal. Then you have the wax, is the next level, is Yitzirah, and that's the Musenu. And that itself, apparently also is already Hamachshav is relating to outside of itself. Okay, so that sums that up. Now finally, you could actually say based on this that Chochmah, Atzilus and Atzilus is maybe the deeper level of the engraved letters. How the etzem is mitzuyer boy, not how the gili ha'etzem. Based on what he's saying here, that the yukran d'malka, the image of God Himself, that could be maybe the deeper level of esis achkika, which the containers don't have. Maybe. It doesn't say that, but remember, the container is describing the energy, describing what it is. So I'm going to explain this in a moment. I just wanted to stick to the text here. Now, finally, he goes to the other extreme. And here he says these words. Ube'emes, here he says the word ube'emes. Look at the two lines from the bottom of page 587. ובאמס עיקרין יקר מוסנו כמו שקציין סכם d'atzilus peilim b'biyah. And now he's going to the other extreme. I'll sum it up in a moment. That the Ikarian, the primary thing of Musenu is actually not even in Atzilus. It's how Atzilus radiates in Biyah. Remember, we just said, Machshava, what's the lower level of thought? How you're thinking how to speak to someone. You're already thinking how to transmit outside of yourself.
Right.
You haven't done it yet, but you're thinking how to do it. So the real primary thing of the Musenu is already an interaction with something outside of Elokus, out of the divine. We're talking now, of course, on the divine level. The Eibush also, Machshava, in other words, there's divine Machshava, how he's still thinking, and it's taking on same shape and form, but it's not yet Azulas to someone else. But the Ikr Dmus is the outer containers, how they pearl in Biyah, and this is
not a contradiction.
Nothing is a contradiction.
The Musa, as it was above, is already thinking about the other.
Correct. And that's what I'm going to explain about. That's all. What you have here is a whole section of the interface being developed. I'm going to go back to that in a moment. So here he calls it nefesh ruach. Al b'chinas akelim d'atzilus, but kelim d'atzilus, how they are in biyah. That's the eir and neshama. That's the level of tzalmenu. So here suddenly now Tzelem and Mus is moving over from Atzilus to Biyah. So in Biyah itself you have two things. You have how the outer containers affect in Biyah, the engraving that it does in Biyah. So Biyah is now becoming the wax. So not Biyah as it's in Atzilus. Biyah is outside of Atzilus. So that's explained that Tikkun Ezer now is literal. The first interpretation was that Biyah, to rely Biyah was within Atzilus. Now he's actually interpreting it actually outside of Atzilus. And then is how the containers of Atzilus, how they're in Biyah. That's a higher level in Biyah. That's Neshama of Biyah. So there's Nefesh Roch of Biyah, there's Neshama of Biyah, and that's Salmenu.
Right.
And this explains also, you see in the parentheses how it all fits. That's how we say Adam. You don't always say Adam only Atzilus. You also say Adam Debriya. So we say Nasa Adam B'Tzalmenu Kid Musenu. According to without this interpretation, ends up being that Tzelem and Mus is only in Atzilus. You don't have Adam Debriya, or Adam more in the creation level, like ourselves. Doesn't have Tzelem and Mus. No. So he explains now that also has it. Okay. And Mekolshkein, Mekolshkein B'Atzilus and B'Chinas Tzelem. And for sure, how those Kelim are in Atzilus, for sure they're at Tzelem.
This is even Atzilus now.
No, because he's not contradicting what he said earlier.
Contradicting, but
No.
he's adding, saying that even the Kelim Atzilus.
Well, listen, if Kelim Briyah have an element of Tzelem, which is like literally an element of divine image, so for sure Atzilus has it. Yeah, that's really... Mashahem B'chinas Demus. How the Iker Al Shem Pul Losan, how they affect Biyah. If you recall, in the previous chapter, and this is how it all ties together, remember the power of the hand to write letters. So it's the power of his pashtus that it can extend and write infinite amount, different ways. But there's the power also to limit what you're going to. But within the hand, before you actually write the letters, it's not really a limit. That's what he's saying here. So the Tzelem and Mus, as it is in Atzilus, is an image, but it's still an image as it's in the power to create an image, based on this. Where does it actually become a letter? It's in other words, you could say it like this, that the seal, even before it creates a seal in the wax, is the power to create a seal, because it's defined, but it hasn't done it yet.
Yeah.
So technically speaking, the seal could have been many different images. So in other words, there's a potential state and an actual state. Like the same thing with thought. When you're thinking, when you're thinking to speak to someone, without that you wouldn't be able to speak to them. They would hear ideas that were not necessarily tailored to them. So the idea that before it actually enters into to someone out, transmits to someone outside of you, you already have the transmitting beginning inside yourself, and then it moves outward. And at the end of this whole thing, that's why the Pamim sometimes Tzelem Elikim, sometimes it says the Mus Elikim. It's all the containers. So it says, is also not Silus, there's the Mus. But if you talk generally, like he says, Be'emes, that's when it really comes down to when it's in Bria, outside of Atzilus. Ubeprati is b'bchinas hakelim atzma zeh b'chinas primis hakelim v'chatzenis hakelim. That's Solomon Mus. Nimtza move on, and there's all this is coming to go back that the Ikar Sakta is the main primary place where there's a unity and fusion between container and energy is in the primis hakelim, because that's the level of Tzameinu. Now, I just want to say the following in explaining the whole thing, because I think it's, if you really, I mean, if you, it's amazing, because what you're doing here is, what he's doing here is dissecting literally, you know, I mean, my visualization is like this. Think of it like an assembly line, a machine that has many, many components. And how do you refine something that is so absolute and so undefined? You know, pashut, as we're saying, and it's something that is beyond any definition and Hagbalah and even potential. How does that get into a structure like such a fundamental, absolute structure of existence? The sun always rises a certain way. There's day and night. Lo yushbeisu. The rules of nature are unwavering, right? So we know. So this says that itself comes from Koyach Ein Sof, because God gave it that type of timidius, gave it this type of perpetuity. That it's exactly. We breathe. I mean, it's a miracle. How many breaths? The way we breathe. All the functions that have to take place. So the question is, how does such structure come from a reality that has no structure at all? When I say no structure, it doesn't mean it's disorganized. It's just not defined. It's posh tachlos apshitus. So we're not talking now about the level of the tzimtzum, which is necessary simply to contain and at least conceal that energy for the time being, so that existence can emerge. We're talking here lower levels of the interface, which is how they begin to interact with each other. So if you think of it like this, if you want to think the big picture goes like this. Atzmus, of course, is Atzmus. Then there's Ayin Sof Mamala Kol HaMetzias. The revelation of Atzmus, in other words, Atzmus is beyond expression. You say Bitzi is built in Metzias Nimtza, you can't even talk about Atzmus in any sense of that he is, he isn't, because he could be and not be, you know, with the whole idea of being space, it's not a reality that we can relate to at all on our terms. And of course I have to always go back and predicate all this on the fact that we're not talking about Atzmus can do anything he wants to do. We're talking about a structure as it is now. How do we relate to that? You know, you could say from Atzmus, who cares? What I just asked, the whole question has no, you could say, is not, it's a logical question based on laws of logic that God created. God's not bound by his laws. If he wants to suddenly connect material existence with spirituality, he can do it. He wants to connect diversity with unity, he can do it. There's no paradoxes there. But he created a world where paradoxes do exist. We do have paradoxes. We can't jump up 100 feet. That's it. You just can't do that. So how does a world that's so governed by absolute rules connect to a God that is not governed by any rules? That's the big question of the interface. Now there are many, many pieces in the whole Ayin Beis that address different parts of it. And it's important not to confuse them. Like if you recall, I actually began writing...
Why does it have to be an interface?
Because then there's no way back. There's no way for us to connect to God. I said it maybe 100 times.
It's that way. That's the only reason.
And also God wanted the structure, so he also creates.
I mean, he didn't have to make an interface. He could have just made right out of Atzmos.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
So the only reason for the interface is so.
But that little only is the purpose of existence.
Okay.
Fine. He wants us to be part of it.
Okay.
Let's put it this way: if God wanted a master and slave relationship, then he creates a world. He puts us there and says, "Serve me," and that's it. But he wanted v'yadaita Hashem. He wanted v'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha. He didn't just say, serve me. He said, love me. He said, know me. That means he wants a partner. Simple as that. Partnership is a whole different story. You know, partnership means a certain type of equality.
Doesn't it necessarily Lamata also? If he's going to put infinite, he wants to put infinite and finite.
No, absolutely. But no, let's put it this way. Absolutely. He keeps saying that. Yichud Mamay Lamata. So it's also from out, but that's after he chose to create a structure. Okay. So then, yes. In other words, you can't say he must have a tzimtzum, but if he's going to create an existence that makes sense, the tzimtzum is a necessity, so to speak. Once God has decided to create. So it is both elements. That once he's decided this is how he wants it, then he also creates with structure, and then we have a way to retrace it. But the ultimate purpose, why did he create it with structure?
Yes.
Look, you could also argue that that structure, logic of existence, at the end of the day, why did Atzmus choose this logic and not another logic? So you could say even quantum, for some reason, relates to this type of structure that another structure may not have actually manifest. But that's really speculation, because, as he says many times, there's so many things in Atzmus that we have no idea about, and it could have been a whole different structure. Then that would have made sense. Or who says who says logic is in general a rule? But the fact of the matter is that God shows an existence that's logical. You have to say that logic has a maila, even in Atzmus, because he did it this way. And, so it's really not the discussion here. It's really where the quantum meets so-called tangible reality. But I just wanted to put it in context, because if you wanted, if I was to do this, if we did an actual visual map, those maps where they focus on different parts and say, okay, now we're focusing.
Quantum, you mean every possibility? I mean, what do you mean by quantum here?
Quantum, every possibility. Atzmus is every possibility. Why did he choose this possibility of 10 spheres? And we don't say 10 remains amorphous. The 10 are 10. There's Eser v'lei Achados, Eser v'lei Tesha. And that's the divine. There's 10 commandments. There's no such thing as 614 mitzvahs. No matter what. Even in quantum. In other words, the quantum has manifested. That's what means. Chokuk be'etzem. It's mitzuyer in the etzem, because the mitzvahs are 613. Even though to us it sounds like a finite number, for some reason that manifests Ratzon Elyon. That's God's will. Someone say, "What do you mean? Only 613? Isn't it an infinite amount of mitzvahs?" No, that's how the etzem has manifest. So, and you can't just say that's a matter. He could have done it differently. You're talking about mitzvahs here. We're not talking about trees and stones. You're talking about another tree, another stone. Anyway,
They're not arbitrary.
They're not arbitrary, exactly. So you have to say that the etzem is there in the 613 or in the 10 or whatever the structure. But let's go back for a moment. Okay.
Is the 613 arbitrary?
No.
I mean, that's mamish nisa.
Yeah, but you could always argue that it's not arbitrary, because once Atzmus manifests in mitzvahs, in Gvul, so to speak, it's always 613. But there's ultimately Atzmus is manifesting in mitzvahs. Mitzvahs don't control Atzmus.
Right.
Could he have done it differently? We don't say he could have done it differently. No, not when it comes to mitzvahs.
No,
Even spheres, it says he could have made more than 10 spheres.
Of course he doesn't.
But mitzvahs, it doesn't say he could have made more than
It
650.
says mitzvahs nisa ha'atzmus.
What do you say that? I mean,
It's
of course he
Messiach's
could have made whatever
Atzmus.
he wanted. He decided.
Because you're talking mitzvahs, you're not talking about now your mitzvah. Well, that's arguable. You could say it's the only way that it's not whether he's limited. That is the reflection of what he is, and that's it. No, I specifically talking about Torah and mitzvahs now. I'm not talking about how many trees are on earth. That's another story, But anyway, let's not go there right now. It's a whole different discussion. What I want to say is like this. You ever see when they make maps, so they have like a map of the world, and then they highlight one part of the map that we're going to focus on now. I think a good way to look at Ayin Beis, because it's such a vast map, is to take, so what part of the interface are we focusing on? I would even do that online when we finally write this down. So basically say, where are we? So there's the higher levels of the interface. We talk about what goes on before the tzimtzum, how Atzmus manifests in how goes through a tzimtzum, and you have the kav and rishimu. But where are we now in the interface? What we are now in the interface is not even chachmas tamah. We talked about where chachmas tamah is where the infinite meets the finite. Here we are really. You're talking here also infinite meeting the finite always, but we're talking here on the level where and Keli interact. That's the focus here. So if you you ever see when they have this these to-do books, these work, they're this. So they tell you how to fix a pipe, let's say. So they take that section of the pipe and they magnify it, and magnify it. You start seeing this piece, that piece, that piece. So there's a lot of pieces in how these two, and how the two pipes connect. We're talking now the pipe of and the pipe of container. Actually, pipe is not a good example because a pipe is a container. It's really how the energy in the pipe connects with the pipe. So basically, here are the levels as where we are right now. We said is Ayin, Keli is Yesh. So let's start with that. That's a critical beginning. That's where the whole subject matter began, back on page 565. Ayin. In other words, what's Ayin, what's Yesh? Is substanceless. It's pashut. But remember, it's not the pshitus. It's not the of lifnei atzimtzum. it has the properties of that. We're talking our air already that's becoming ready to enter into a container. We're also not talking about air of Tohu, which shattered the container. But it's still, but its fundamental property is ayin, not yesh. Even after all the diminishing, it's still light. Think of it like sunlight. You can wear shades, you can wear 50 shades, but it's still sunlight, no matter what happens. How many veils you put on it, it didn't become a container. It just, so still it retains the property of light. And the property of energy is such, as we discussed in detail, it reflects its source, it is similar to its source, and what was the third thing? And
He wants to go back? Wants to go back?
and wants to go back to the source. So its identity is not itself. It's not into itself. It's all into its source. Completely dedicated to where it's coming from. Keli is yesh. Now yesh here, let's not say the yesh you say in a fabrengi, you're a yesh. We're not talking about that yesh. We're talking about a yesh that now it has identity. And it has divine identity. God wants it to have identity. We're not talking about someone who's fighting for for his ego. We're talking about the identity of Chachma, of Bina, but its identity. And a Keli is not dovuk to the Moir. So it's not, even though it has a relationship with the source, as we're going to discuss, but compared to the energy, you're not talking about a container. So it's not the sunlight diminished. It's now where the sun, let's say, manifests, let's say in a plant, and it makes the plant grow. So the light interacts with the container, but it's no longer just pure light. You're not talking about something that has identity. Now, one second, diminish this many more times, and you can have Ur and Keli in our world, where there's almost no energy visible, and all you see is containers, a table. But for argument, if you were able to see a table in Atzilus, you would see a table that's complete, subjugated to what its purpose is. You can't use it for anything else. But it's still a table, so to speak. It has an identity. Not a tangible physical table, but you get the idea. It has an identity. It's a container. That's called yesh. Now the question is, what happens to these two and how they interact? I'm going to dissect that in a moment. You wanted to say something?
Then why don't we say yesh, or also have a yesh
Relative
identity? Because in time and other places it says there's ma-or and there's or, and they're not identical. So once you have or, you have an identity that's different than the ma-or.
So as a matter of fact, he said here that if you really break it down, gamo era gilu kumei dover neisif. Of course, but 1 second. The difference, I just gave an example. There's the sun, there's the sunlight, and there's, let's say, a plant that the sun is going to help make grow. Or there's us, there's our eyes. We see each other because there's daylight. So there are three things here. So of course the sunlight is already outside of the essence, but you can't call it a dover nesa because all it's doing is what the essence wants it to do. The sun doesn't make a distinction between a pile of garbage, as Chassidus says, or a palace. It shines. But when it comes on the container level, there is a difference. This is Chachma, this is Bina, and so on. So they're all, obviously everything outside of the Etzem is already some form of expression. But that's very much part of the interface. How much of it is focusing on the expression of the source, and how much is focusing on the identity of the diverse creature, so to speak? Let's put it this way, I'll be more blunt. If you didn't have Kalim, we would never be able to make a dir b'tachtenim. The only thing we can do is subjugate ourselves to the light. But the difference between you and I, that ein de'esei and Shabbos, that we have different opinions, would never be permeated with Alakus. We'd have to all essentially surrender our identities to a divine light. That would be a world with Eris, no Kalim. Which of course, on the other hand, if you have Kalim and no Er, our identities would be very powerful, but there wouldn't be that unifying element. Remember, interface means it has to have a part of individuality and diversity that the containers provide, and part of what does Hashem want, which is what the air provides. If you had a Kalim and no air, we'd all be following what Hashem wants, but we wouldn't really be connected to the source, because the energy is what reflects and tells us what the source is really like. You know, sometimes, by the way, Kalim is mitzvahs and Torah is air. What would we have with mitzvahs without air? We would do things, but we would never understand them, and we would never have a process of how do you establish a halacha. There wouldn't be that whole processing of understanding how God's mind works. You'd have what God wants us to do. That's the containers. But you wouldn't have a reflection of what God wants us to do. And you could ask, what happens if we have only atzmus and no eris and kelim? So obviously we go back to a complete, reality that doesn't relate to us. So everything is relative, ultimate. But remember, this he made it very clear. The keli to the is not like the to the etzem. Because keli does not reflect Keli can describe it, can relate to it. Is truly a pure channel for the divine. It doesn't have any other agenda, not 1% agenda otherwise. Completely dedicated, and not by will even. It's just what it is.
We know where the or comes from. Where did the kelim come from?
The kelim come from the koyach hagvul of atzmus, the ability to create something that's not similar to himself, basically, or not similar in a revealed way.
And but they're after the tzimtzum.
They're revealed after the tzimtzum, but before the tzimtzum, they're like two powers. You could say it's the power to emanate and the power to withhold. That's how they rooted. That's how they're rooted.
I mean, like chesed and gvur, like.
Yeah, in a way, yeah. In its root, in its deepest root.
Go back to the beginning.
And
The beginning of the book.
Yeah, and the tzimtzum reveals the power to withhold, which is completely submerged in the power to emanate before the tzimtzum, because there God's presence dominates.
And the tachlis is to mevatel the keli to the or, correct? The tachlis.
I would say, yeah, absolutely. The keli and er become a joint effort.
It's careless.
Look, the best example is our
But not
Rebbe.
to your wife.
No, the best example is our Rebbe and Chassidim. The Rebbe said, "There's something up to us."
Your wife.
That's how it is. He didn't just say, "Be bottled to me," and then go. There's something up to us. Look, it's a constant. Remember, there's a constant tension between the two, which is also part of it. That's the tension between Er and Keli, which we're going to discuss soon. But let me go back now. So now let me break it further.
Just in other words, could we just say, is it true, is accurate to say that it's like, in other words, it's like if there was just auras, it's like mashpia and kalim is makabel.
Yeah.
So you could say that if there's no kalim, there's no makabel, so the aura would just.
Yeah, you could say that absolutely. That's another way to put it. Yeah. He does. I didn't use makabel because that's not really the word he's using here. He's using more identity. There'd be no identity. In there's no identity. Is just like I said, sunlight. I mean, in this example, sunlight just shines. Sunlight doesn't even distinguish between a place of kedusha and a place of no kedusha. Like one Holocaust survivor told me, he was angry at the sun because the sun would rise in this place of death. That same sun. So there's an indifference there that is, in that context, right?
Is there a difference between or and shefa and what we're talking about?
Yeah, of course there's a difference. But it's not. You see, you can't bring everything into one mimer. Earlier, shefa relative to no, but shefa is not
Shefa changed. My question.
But he's not discussing shefa.
I understand. But at one point he does discuss or and shefa.
But not in this
not
this context.
But or doesn't change anything; it just shines on it. And
Shefa
changes things.
No, that's not the way I would define it exactly. But fine. Why do we have to go there?
Why are you going to show?
Because we're always talking about or and kli.
That's exactly what he wants to talk about.
I understand, but or doesn't change anything; it just shines.
I don't know if that's the correct way to put it. Where does he say that? That you put such a line?
Do I remember where he says it?
No, but it doesn't say it here. He's not talking. That aspect of that it shines and doesn't change anything is completely not related to this part of the Hemshech.
That's what's bothering me so much.
Not everything has to be. There's a very diverse. It's like, why don't you talk about octopuses now? They're also connected to Avdus Hashem.
Just the octopus shining into the cave.
No, I'm saying. I mean, my point is, you can always bring everything into the picture. Everything has a role. Erev Shefa is not really relevant here because this is a way of. Erev Shefa is a whole different discussion. He talks about earlier Erev Shefa, where he talked about where was I forgot already where, but it doesn't matter.
Exactly what you're talking about. It shines anywhere and everywhere, like it shines on a plant. The plant grows. But when Shefa comes down, Shefa Mamish gets involved and changes what.
But Erev Shemesh, the sunlight is not Shefa. It's Erev. Shefa is an example of a teacher transmitting ideas.
Yes.
Okay, but that's not what he's talking here. I'm thanking you for the fifth time. This is not the discussion. Why do you want to force? Is there a problem, or you want to just connect everything in your mind that you've learned?
I don't know how to answer that question either.
Because there's no, I don't see a dilemma here that we need Shefa to answer. That's the thing, and that's why I don't want to bring it in. That's why one Masechta, you don't talk about another Masechta. Is it all connected? Yes. If once you get the whole picture, Shefa has a role also in the interface, because Shefa is where meets Keli in a different type of way, where it's more on the level of the Kalim. But that's not what he's saying right here, So bottom line is when you dissect now that where the Eir meets Keli. So I just wanted to sum up how this breaks down at this levels here. So we're talking about Tselem and the Mus. Okay, if God did not create man or the human being in the image of the divine, we're lacking a fundamental piece of the interface. So that's like a critical pasuk. Hashem wanted us to be created in His image, and obviously it also complicates the plot, because if there's no that, then we'd be, as I said, master and a slave. Who says we're in the image of God? Who says we have to relate to God? Who says we have to, when it says v'halachta b'drachav, emulate me? How could we emulate God? Which really you could say is almost a question of someone that doesn't know Chassidus, is more of the shita of the Musar. God is infinite, and what you're arrogant to think you're going to relate to God. But when we say Rosh Hashanah, we don't just say we're Eved. We're an Eved to Hashem. We also say we're a Ben, and we say all kinds of other examples. So the Tselem and the Mus, which is a pasuk in Chumash that can be disputed. In other words, this is not a Chassidish concept. So anyone, whether you're Chassid or a Litvak, believes in that pasuk. And the pasuk says not just Tselem but also Dmus. So it's a vital piece in identifying the interface. What does this pasuk mean? So he explains it here. It goes like this: that we're talking here energy, as I just said, has no identity. It's substanceless. Its identity is to reflect the source. So it's already not the source, but it's an expression of the source. Then you have the container's identity of existence. Now, here's the question: how are these two going to meet? So the Rabbi Shabbat, in explaining the interface, says there's a Tselem and there's a Dmus. And these are two ways of describing, merging the infinite divine with the finite identity of existence. And in doing so, I think is the beauty of it, is that really Tselem and Dmus are really words to be used relatively on many different levels. You can say that Oyer, this goes back to what you asked me, the energy is really Tselem. Because it's not Atzam, it's not the Etzem anymore. The energy is a snapshot of the Etzem, you can say. But it's a snapshot. I don't want to use snapshot because that's static. Think of it like a ray of light flowing out of a projector. So there's nothing on the wall, all you see is white light. This light is already at Tselem. Because if the Etzem didn't have Oyer, we'd see nothing. There'd be no images at all. But only thing you could say, this is Surah Atzmis. It's the image of the divine. If the divine looked like something, this is what it would look like. You know what it looks like? Oyer. Complete bittul, amorphous, doesn't have shape and form. Again, I don't want to say that's what the Etzem would look like, because the Etzem is far beyond. We say the Atzmus is not even Moyer. But we're talking about how the Etzem chooses to manifest now. So Eir is a reflection of the divine, and that's why everything will come from Eir. That's why Chassidus makes such a focus that even the Kalim, in actuality, are also nishavim from the Eir, because Eir is God's messenger. You can think of it like the chief of staff. Everything that comes out from the Etzem, Eir is going to be the carrier. Even the power of the Yesh. Remember we spoke earlier how even though Atzmus is necessary to create a Yesh Ma'in, but how does he do it? The process comes through Eir, Me'ein HaMoyer, which carries. Think of it, Eir is like the ultimate tool of the divine, but it's not an outside tool. It's a reflection. So Eir is, on that level, is Tselem, and containers are Dmus. What's Dmus? Dmus is the image from the image. So this is an image, and now let's say use an example of, let's say, the seal and the wax. So container is now how the image is creating an identity. So let's put it this way: if you look at the Eir itself, you're not going to see identity. You're not going to be able to distinguish between Chachma and Bina and Chesed and Gvura and so on. But if you look at the container will say, "This is what the Eir told me to do." So now I have an identity. My identity is Chachma. My identity is Bina. So the containers are not outside of the purpose, but they are manifesting the identity of the divine, where the Eir is just expressing what the divine wants. So if you're able to really, remember, Eir and Keli, both of them are not physical and Atzilus. So how do we distinguish? If we were able to look at an Eir and a Keli and Atzilus, they're both Eir at the end of the day. I don't mean they're Eir. I mean to say they're both not, they're not made of substance. Like, you could say, for example, let me think of an example. When I words on a page, so you say the letters themselves are containers. The idea is the oyer. But what is it? Natsilis. So Natsilis, the example he gives is machshava. What are the letters on a page are tangible, but what do letters look like inside the brain? If you opened up, if you dissected an idea, you wouldn't find letters there. But there's definitely in the idea itself, the energy of the idea, the intensity of the idea, and there's the expression of the idea. The idea has parameters. When you put it on paper, you realize those parameters were already there in your mind. That's why you really need a power of abstraction here, because he's talking how it all is in its source. We know it exists because we see it from here. Now, remember this: why it's so difficult, really, initially to relate to all this is because we don't think like this. We see a table. Someone tells us, "Okay, the table was created by God. That means there's divine energy in it. I have some sense of it, but it's so intangible." We don't think in terms of inner and outer all the time. We have to be told, "You have something. This is its purpose." But remember, from the perspective of the divine, everything begins with, everything is there for a reason. So Eris and Kalim in the root in Atzilus is basically the beginnings of the purpose and the identity. Or the descriptive name or the functional name. Now the purpose is the function. You want to take a cup to drink wine, it's not just to sit in the cup. The purpose of Chochmah is to produce Chochmah. But its root is rooted in a divine element that is a description of what it is, not what it's doing. In our world, we have a dichotomy between what we do and who we are. In Atzilus, there's no such dichotomy. Keli is what you do. Eir is what you are. But they're fused as one, and they understand. That's why it says Iyu v'chayu echad, Iyu v'gamu echad. The Kelim are according to the Kavanah. But if you want to imagine why are they different than containers in light, you have to always think of the hypothesis when they don't work together. And that's when the containers are off their own agenda, which is not Natzilus. And so that's where you have what you do and what you are is not the same thing. Your Shema Teir and your Shema Pul are not one. So basically, Eir and Keli are Tzelem and Mus. That's in the broad sense of it. Then in the interface, you focus even more into the pipe, and you start seeing, one second, the container itself has an element of Tzelem, and in this context, Eir is more amorphous. It's not a different level. It's just more. It's more. You're breaking it into details more.
You need to call up Pixar do a feature-length animation.
You could.
You absolutely.
Yeah.
What?
This is.
What example?
So he needs to call up Pixar, and
If you do an animation of this and did it in the right way,
it would be unbelievable.
yeah, because psychology and physics even don't come close to this type of dissecting. Because first of all, there's no one there that's a messenger from above that can tell us what's going on in the world of Chachmas Tema. Einstein was able to figure out some things, but here we're talking about this is like being told where from the source. Like we wouldn't have figured this out on our own exactly, because.
That's all I have.
One second, but one second. Let me just go. So now Selim moves over the container itself, because remember the interface has to be one that is complete joining. Here you can still argue, okay, but where do Eir and Keli meet? The Eir always is reflecting its source. The Keli is its identity. So in Atzilus everything is fine, because there's enough. It's called Gili Alakus, that the Kelim are aligned. But what happens when you start diminishing the Eir? So how does that Keli meet the Eir? So here comes that the Keli itself also has its element mus. So even our container level, even as we are in what we do, there's also who we are. If you remember, we discussed this. So even on our container level, there's also an element of tzelem. So the container is therefore now have been elevated a bit. That's, remember, if you remember, the container meets the energy. We gave the example of the wick and the flame. You could have a wick and a flame. God could have made that any object has fuel for fire. It's not that way. An object has to have a certain properties, has to be refined. Like a wet wick is not going to burn. A piece of metal doesn't burn. So you see the container itself, there can be levels of the container, how refined it is. This is critical because this adds to the interface. If you didn't have that, then all containers would be one big block of, let's say, clay. And then you fit them into the energy. But no, it's not the case. You actually refine the container. you want to be a keli to the divine, you have to do something about it. You have to be mezachich yourself. Let's say when we prepare to go into a holy place, you go Yom Kippur, you don't just jump in, you prepare your keli for it. So in other words, it's not just a container, the container itself has gradations. And generally is the tzelem and musna on the level of the kelim. So now the keli, the inner container, would be, I mean, I'll give a real example. I think I gave the example. A real practical, avoidadik example. I mean, it's not. I'm just using an example. I don't know if it's perfect in every way, but I think it can help understand it, at least relate to it. We all have Shabbos on weekdays. You can say Shabbos is a day of Eir, and weekdays are days of Kelim. Right? Shabbos is Eir HaKdusha, Mekadsha Mekayma, Veichul HaShamayim. You know, don't get me wrong, Shabbos is also containers, but I mean, relatively speaking. Weekdays, Hashem says, go out there and do your thing. We know we need both. Shabbos reminds us of the source. Let's not forget why you're out there in the world. But 6 days of the week is the kavanah. It's not 6 days of Shabbos and 1 day is weekday. Though it would have been nice, you know? Or maybe boring, I don't know. But, so 6 days, the kavanah is to go into your identity, to go into a world, a material world where there's kelim, that are not aware of godliness, like on Shabbos, and to bring the kedusha of Shabbos there, so to speak. Okay. So, the question is, where does Shabbos and weekdays meet? So we're told that Shabbos blesses the weekdays have a little Shabbos in them. For example, it says Chassidus, the 3 tefillos is the Shabbos Shabbat. When you daven in the morning, Mincha, Ma'ariv, that's Shabbos in Chayil, so to speak. For example, Talmud Chacham Ikra Shabbos. Talmud Chacham is called Shabbos. Talmud Chacham all week long is on the level of Shabbos. Obviously, it's not Shabbos halachically, but you know the story. There's a chassid came to the Friedrich Rebbe. It was the middle of the week. And he asked the Friedrich Rebbe to say a Maimer Chassidus. So the Rebbe said, "It's the weekdays. I say on Shabbos." He says, "When I come to the Rebbe, it's Shabbos." So the Rebbe came out and said a Maimer. So you have the Shabbosdik so-called spirit in microcosm. So right there you see there's an interface. Now if you only had Shabbos and weekday and there was no davening weekdays, God forbid, or anything like that, then you'd have a big disconnect. Here you have all week. That's like what the Rebbe brings very often from Tanya, that even a businessman has to learn, and even a person who's learning all day has to give tzedakah. There's no such thing as just exclusive one identity. There's always interface going on.
How do we understand it? Hayom Shekula Shabbos Menucha Lo Chai Momi. There will be a time when it's only Shabbos.
It's a very good question, but remember that's a time after 6,000 years of Chayil. 6 days of the week.
That time is going to be forever.
So relatively speaking, you can imagine there's also Eretz and Kalim there. But after this hard work that we're doing, we refine the containers of Golos to that extent that the world is a Keli for that, but then we'll be elevating, and every elevation compared to the next level, the lower level is a Keli. I mean, that's really the gist of it. But anyway, to go back now to, so therefore what I wanted to say was like this. So here's the Primis Chitzenis HaKelim. You could say, okay, you know, all week long, like Shammai, I'll prepare for Shabbos. I see a good piece of food, that's for Shabbos. I see a good idea for Shabbos. But what about refining the weekday, like Hillel says, every day? So here, the question is, does the container also have an element of tzelem? Or do you have to wait for the Ur to come for the... So the answer is no. In your work, not even when you're davening, in your work, there's B'chol Derchecha Deyu, Chol Masech L'Shem Shemayim. In your work, there's Hashgacha Pratis. You can find examples of godliness in your physical, material labor, even if it's even though it's not Ur B'Golet. So that's what this part of the interface adds. That even in container level, even on the weekday, on its weekday level, not weekday, the Shabbos within weekday, you also can find something that's Tzelem Elokim. That's the point here.
Like mock the Eretz Yisrael.
Yeah.
Make the whatever you want.
Now there's the outer container, that's your function. So if someone asks you, what do you do? Someone will say, I'm a fundraiser. This one will say, I'm a financial advisor. I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm a whatever. What do? I work for my brother. What does your brother do? He's looking for a job. You know? It's also a job. That's the Keli to the Keli, right? So whatever it is you're doing, that's what you do. But who are you? Like the story with the Tzemach Tzedek, right? That Chassid started changing his clothing. He says, I started dressing like a secular person, a business person. She said, because the Rebbe, And I realized I'm being a hypocrite. I'm dressing in this whole Levushe Big Day Kaddish. So there's someone else that said, I thought it was the opposite. That when you're out there, you're masquerading. And here's where you really are. So that's what it comes down to. Who are you? You are a chassid. You are an neshama that God sent down to this earth 24/7. Not just on Shabbos and Yom Kippur. You're always a shliach, 24/7. Question is how it manifests. There's sometimes you're dressing like the garments of Esav, and sometimes you're dressed like Kel Yankov. So you need to have both. The point here is in the interface, every level needs everything. So the Keli needs. So basically, you can say Primus HaKeli is the Eir Shebi Keli, if you want to put it that way. And of course, there's the Keli Shebi Eir as well, which he discussed earlier. The Eir has to come to a point where it acts, behaves like the properties of a Keli, and the Keli properties of there. That's where they meet. But that's Primus HaKonsenis Keli. Now, and so that's Tzelem and Mus, but it goes further. It doesn't stop there. It goes further and says that in the Kelim itself, this is all still in Atzilus. Now he says, the truth is that even the lower level outside of Atzilus, now you're already transmitting outside of Atzilus, there too there's a Tzelem and Mus. And that's obviously critical, because my example that I gave was outside really of Atzilus. But let's talk about, so I was speaking within Atzilus itself, subtly, as you said, if you see the image, you're already seeing the containers of Atzilus, you're seeing the Tzelem part. But where does it really manifest? That's what he says here at the end, Be'emes. Where is it really? How it's outside of Atzilus. And that's already Adam Debriya. Now we're not even talking about Asiya, Gashmis, just to show you how high this is. But what we have now is already an identity that is outside of Atzilus. You no longer call it pure Elokus. Now we're talking about the beginning of Elam Abriya. Says there's already Miktzos Ra even. The Elam Abriya, you're talking now created existence. And here, Adam Debriya, this is where Tzelem and Mus also manifest. So the same Tzelem that we called before on Oyer and Primus HaKelim, now we're talking about also comes down and manifests in the level of Biyah, or Briya. And that's the main place where it plays itself out. And that's why it says in Tikkun Zeir that the seal is Briya and the wax is Yitzira. So the bottom line is, why is this so relevant? Because you can make the big argument, all this is very nice in Atzilus. But you start diminishing the Elokus of Atzilus and get all the way to Ara Asiya Gashmis, there's no image of God here. The image has been completely concealed. But that's not the case. You and I sitting right here in Elam Hazah Gashmi, we say you created B'Tselem Elokim. We're not just saying Adam was created. Every child of Adam is Tzelem Elokim. You say, what's that? But we're so far away. When Hashem says to Adam, Ayeka, where are you? What did he mean? I don't recognize you. I don't recognize the Tzelem Elokim. What have you done with yourself? Of course God knew where he was. Like the Alter Rebbe said, what have you done with your life? What have you... So it says when an animal looks at a human being, an animal will never attack a human being, even a predator, even a wild animal. It says in Sfarim, because they see the Tzelem Elokim. Well, we see the fact is otherwise. So it says in Sfarim because they don't see the Tzelem Elokim. The sin can cover it. An Avera can conceal it. Daniel, in the lion's den, Daniel in the lion's den, they saw it, that's why they didn't touch him. So in other words, the Tzelem Elokim is here with us all the time. I remember once at a Fabrengen, the Rebbe said, so everybody's face here is an image of God. And he gave, we talked about the Yud Kei Vav Kei. The Yud is, I think, the eyes, the Vav is the nose, the mouth is the Hey, the ears is the other, Yud Kei, So Yud Kei Vav Kei is the image of a face. Anyway, the point being is that the Tzelem and Mus don't carry, that's why it's so vital, the end of this chapter in Reish Tzadik, that it carries over not just in Atzilus. But on the other hand, because it's rooted in Atzilus, that's why the same thing manifests in lower than Atzilus. So bottom line is, this is really the classic microcosm-macrocosm thing. It's in the macrocosm that way, or the other way, it's the microcosm, that's why the macrocosm. If you don't have the hiskalos, if you don't have the container there in the level, on the highest levels, then the container later won't retain those properties. So you need to have, like I said, Eishis HaMachshava, the thought For you to speak to somebody else, it's not just enough for you to think ideas. You need to be able to actually formulate letters that will ultimately then become real letters, that will ultimately be committed to a page. But it originates in the letters in the brain, in the mind, in the idea. If there were no letters in the idea, there would be a cutoff. So you're constantly talking about how do you maintain the connection between the source and existence, and the lifeline is never severed. That's the critical thing. Because, Tanya says that Dir B'Tachtenim, that this is the world, the lowest of all worlds. And he explains, lower doesn't mean in space. It means in gradations, right? In Revelation. The lowest of all the world. The Rebbe once said in a Fabrenyan, what he means the lowest? It could be lower. It could be in a world that doesn't just deny God, but a world that proves that God doesn't exist. That's what the Rebbe once asked. It's not Tachtu Shalachain, Tachtu Lamatim, there's worse. I mean, for example, the Rebbe didn't say this, but think of the world during the Holocaust in a concentration camp. That's Tachtu Shein, Tachtu Lamatim.
So that's our world.
That's this world.
Potential.
It's the tachlis of the world.
That's our
But
world.
actually everything was always that way.
Okay.
A world that dominated by people who not only deny, that behave like God and complete destroy anything that's godly.
That's the world.
That's not the world.
What are you talking about?
We wouldn't be sitting here.
Over a billion Muslims. There's over a billion Catholics. What are you talking about? The world.
Yeah, but there's 14 million Jews. There could have been a world without Jews.
Okay,
according to you.
so it could be worse. So
That's exactly the point.
They're not denying God.
I also say, I don't know, that's a very racist statement that he made there.
I'm very proud of it.
I think the 14 million Jews pose more problems than they do, if you really ask me.
So we got a few guys sitting around the table, nobody else,
All right.
whatever it is.
No, the point I'm making, no, there's a point I'm trying to make here.
What did the Rebbe say?
The Rebbe said that's because then it would have been then there would be no room for a dira, our logic, exactly that. It would be airtight. It would be an airtight reality that would never leave room to reconnect. So it's tach n'shein tach l'matim, maybe hypothetically, but not in the scheme of a godly plan. We would have no way out. I mean, let's put it this way, God forbid, I don't even want to say, if Nazis dominated from the beginning of time till today, and no way to get out of that, we'd be enslaved. Look, the fact of the matter is today we're a free people. Jews were not always free. And you could say that the cards were stacked against them. They're living under pogroms, crusades, inquisitions, Mitzrayim, exactly. There's no room. But there's always a glimmer. That's why there was a kav after the tzimtzum. If there was no kav, we'd be in big trouble. Because then the tzimtzum. Now, of course, God is there, but then again, it's kol yachol. You'd need to have something that is completely miraculous. There's no way back for us. I don't remember exactly what the Rebbe answered, but if I recall, that was I didn't hear it. I heard it later. I heard it repeated. Bottom line is that it's not airtight. As much as this is an agnostic existence, like he says, "Mole klippas v'sitra achra," filled with klippas v'sitra achra, and with forces. But if you look in Tanya, the Perek Lamed Vav, he doesn't begin. It's the darkest. He begins first is concealment. Ad shehu mole klippas v'sitra achra. And ad till the point that you have those that say ani v'afsi'ei, there's nothing else but me. So it begins with if there was no tzimtzum, there would be no possibility for one person hurting another. But it doesn't mean we have to hurt each other. So there's a big difference between a potential. So, for example, there's a beautiful sikh in Miketz Tov Shemem Zayin, where the Rebbe says, what would have happened if Adam and Chava, what kind of world did they live in? They had an Eitz Hadas, fine. But they didn't have real evil yet. They weren't contending with greedy, selfish murderers. There was none of that. It was a Gan Eden. It was a pure world. But there was one thing they were said, don't eat from that tree. Whatever that symbolizes. It definitely symbolizes free will, and it symbolizes, for them, that was their so-called Nisayan, their evil. Don't eat from that tree.
Symbolizes free will, but they had Bechira, otherwise we wouldn't have been screwed.
But here's the thing. So the Rebbe says, what would have happened would have been, it's brought from Maimorim. It's a very beautiful content. He says, the world they lived in was potentially the world that we were going to live in. It just didn't happen yet. But once there's a concealment of the divine presence, so potentially you have everything that's going to be coming later. So had they not eaten from the tree of knowledge, what they would have done is that world that conceals God, that potentially can create all the problems that we have, would have been turned into a world that no longer can potentially create that. That's Mashiach. Unfortunately, they ate. Then the 7 generations of more, so it became more and more. Potential sin became actual sin. So the concealment is no longer God is just hiding His presence. Now we've already acted on it, and we've misbehaved and fed into it. So now you have real problems. But now when we transform the world, we transform into a place that one day, like the Rebbe says, the difference between Beis Hamikdash, Rishon, Shani, and Shlishi. The first two Beis Hamikdash, as holy as they were, they potentially could be destroyed. They were. The Beis Shlishi, this one already can never be destroyed. Why? Because now we're destroying even the potential part, because we're changing the world through our work. Not just we're not doing a sin. We're actually revealing godliness so that Tzimtzum is no longer going to be a force that can allow for. So it's not like when Mashiach comes, everyone's just choosing to. The world will be so refined that there was no longer a potential for sin. So it's more than just destroying sin; it's destroying the potential. So in other words, when the Rebbe Rashab cried over the fact that he doesn't see God, like Avraham Avinu.
There'll still be a potential. They'll be out of Miklat. Won't they be out of Miklat? Isn't that the question?
No,
The first stages, not later. That's only the first
Yeah,
stages.
and explain that they're just for previous.
In a Gersa Kedesh,
They're for
Simcha
previous
Vav, he
sins
talks.
that they did before.
Yeah. In Simcha Vav, he talks about this. That's mitzvah Taylor. I mean, it's stages. We're talking about at some point for sure. Once Or Chatum Avim in Aretz, then there's no. But then there's still the stages till you get there. There's the shchita of the shechting, the Yetzer Hara. That's going to be nice to see. And the tzaddikim will see the Yetzer Haras were like this, or like that. And the Rishonim will see the Yetzer Hara was just a little nothing. And that's what you had to deal with. And that's what made your life so crazy. The point is that, okay, so let's move on now. That's a summation of that. Now, I'm going to page Tov Kuf Tzadik. I'm going to just do. I might as well do the summary of the mimer. Start from the middle here. Lahavin Kol Zeh Yesh Lahagdim Mashnas Bar Leil, right before the beginning of the parak. Again, the questions of the Maimorim, even though the Rebbe Rashab is part of the mimer, but just for efficient purposes, I'll do that another time. And we could always include it in the video series. Is this working all right? You want to check a second?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, good.
Good.
Well, and this is a summary of the whole last mimer. The middle of Tav Kuf Tzadik. Yeah. The Ikra, the primary place where Er and Keli unite is in Primis HaKeli, as we just discussed. In containers, there's two levels: outer, inner, and outer. Generally, it's Salmenu Kud Museinu, outer and inner containers. Salmenu refers to a essential shape and form. It's like the first impression of the divine, in this case. That means a shape that's engraved in the essential thing. In this case, the essential thing is what? Is the seal. He said earlier the seal is Er. So Keli makes an engraving in the Er, in the energy. Remember, we're talking here the general interpretation, the broad one, which is inner and outer containers. The Etzim, he said earlier, it's really, as they said, Surah Rishena, you could say, is Er. But that's really in the breakdown. The Hibkin is Primis HaKeli. And that Surah, that first shape that is made in the first engraving, embossing, in the energy, is Primis HaKeli. Shichuka Be'etzem HaEr. That's engraved in the essential energy. And he gives the example, like the letters in thought. To himself. We're not talking about speaking to someone else. When you're thinking of an idea to yourself, you're thinking of a concept. So definitely there's letters there. There's some form to the idea. You may not be perceiving the letters. You may not be thinking A, B, Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Dalet. But there's some form. Where are those letters? Those letters are engraved in the idea. And the idea is the dominating force. And you don't sense them at all. The only thing you sense, you reveal, is the idea that you're consciously thinking about. And and how the idea is to you, to no one else. V'chitzenis hakeli, and the outer part of the container, hu kamoshel esis hamachshava shechesha ve'esis, is the lower level of thought, where you're already thinking and concentrating on the letters that you're going to speak to someone.
Is that it? Or you're not even yet at the level of thinking?
Well, look at the parentheses. V'hainu b'machshava shayacha el azulos.
Okay.
That is the yeah, I mean, you could break it into levels, of course.
Okay, good.
Because look, even if you're not communicating to someone, you could actually think you could think in terms and words.
Right. Because
Look, I was reviewing it, for example, in my mind, Shabbos, this last Perek. So I've noticed myself doing this. You could think of the ideas and just get you have a sense of it. But then you could actually think of, what were the first 5 lines that he said. All in your thought.
But at that first level, this is where I have trouble with the first thing, where it's oisius, but it's in an gushing cloud. I mean, that's what
No, because you're not, no, the idea you are not margish. You're not thinking, for example, in terms of, like you would think a sentence.
Right.
Like they're saying, let's say 2 + 2 = 4.
You margish the idea.
Yeah, here, I'll give you 2 + 2 = 4. Those are words. When you think 2 + 2 = 4, you're not thinking 2, 4. You just know that it's the idea is radiates.
Okay.
And then you say, what? Tell me what you just thought. And you say, I thought 2 + 2 = 4. I mean, I'm just giving a simple example, but let's put it this way. One thing is for sure. As soon as you're consciously thinking of things, there are 2 things going on.
Right.
There's an idea, and there's its form. There are definitely 2 things. They're just so bound as one that the form is not is not distinguishable.
Gotcha.
Look, a person who's a communicator in speaking or writing, what they're doing is taking ideas, and that's the difficult part, and giving it containers that can be expressed. But there's no question there's containers before as well.
But those containers, so somebody who never learned language before, who never learned, you never studied, somebody
We talked about this.
It
It doesn't matter, but he's consciously thinking. There has to be something. Remember, there's a state before conscious thought, which is all the ideas in our mind that we're not consciously. Whatever it is. Who says, you don't need to know English or Russian. Let me ask you a question. Song doesn't have a language. What language is that? It still has a form.
Language.
Visualization.
Visualization, music, all part of what we call oisius.
Look, song is an example. You don't need to know
Somebody
anything.
who lives in Africa, right, and he's thinking in his mind about how to capture the lion.
Yeah, but there's some
Never
people-
studied.
One second. I see some people in Crown Heights that also think about that, except not a
There
line.
are structures going on as well.
Where do those
That's
structures
what we
come
call
from
oisius.
now? Where do those structures?
No. So hold on.
What are those
The
aliens?
answer is that a nefesh neisa asis, a nefesh klula ba'asis. So this talks about this at length, that the soul has letters. Just like the same way the containers of Atzilus come from. The soul has containers, not just energy. That's the bottom line.
The soul.
The soul has containers as well.
Hebrew letters? Every single.
Forget about Hebrew now. The whole world was all Hebrew first before it became confused. So I mentioned in the Sikh, he brings from a commentary in Gemara that they found a child in Scotland who had no parents and they're speaking Hebrew. But that's not relevant here. We're not even talking about which language. The soul has issues. That's why the Chassidus brings, and some of Rabbi says, why is it that a child learns language so quickly? The language is a complicated thing, and all linguistics deal with this. They can't really handle it. They all conclude that there have to be some formulations before the child is born. That now, then what sticks to it is what language, but it's sticking to some structure. In other words, you're processing something with structure. That structure right now is not English, French, or Spanish, or Hebrew. When your parents say speak English, it becomes English. But the same child could have grown in Russian, they would be Russian. Language, what language, the actual language to speak is almost secondary here. But the fact is that they already relate to the idea of expressing something. They even say today baby language. When a child whimpers, there's this woman going around now that they say it's true that she has 4 or 5 sounds. You can tell hunger, pain, and 4 different things that child will express, and the sounds are different. So even a child can giggle, and a child can cry. Where did they get that from? No one taught them to giggle. They never saw anyone giggle before. Maybe God's giggling up there, But I mean to say the soul has not just energy; it also has built-in kalim that are. Let's put it this way: they're like think of it like those coloring books that have not been colored yet. They're outlines. They're not yet been filled by an actual language. A song is a very good example. Song, even as adults. What, you're going to sing a song. You know what song you're going to sing right now.
I mean, a nigga without words. Without
Yeah, niggun without words. But it also has structure. One niggun doesn't sound like another. Okay. So, he says, he's adding now what you asked, b'derech klal. So generally, it's a thought that's necessary for speaking. But yes, you could hypothetically speak about a lower level of thought that's connected to letters, that's not the first level of thought. But generally, it's a thought connected to speech. Remember, there's so many levels of interface here, you know? I mean, I guess, as a speaker, I could tell you this. There's different types of speakers. There are people who are very good at, have very formulated ideas. They don't have to prepare and read it from a paper. Not only at the speech, beforehand as well. They're just very good at, but there is a strength when somebody formulates ideas, puts it down, reads it, maybe 20 times, 30 times, and then he may later say it without reading from it. You know, and then there are people who actually read speeches. Now, even those that read speeches, usually it's a speech they've read before. I'm not, I'm not talking about somebody who's just reading someone else's speech. But there's no question, if you want to have a pure interface of get the ideas as clearly as possible, all the way to the recipient, you want to have machshava, you want to have dibur sheba machshava, you want machshava sheba dibur, and then dibur sheba dibur. That would be the best flow. And you know, it simply is a process of educating someone how to publicly speak, how to present an idea. So you have the idea, now you get them to communicate it, organize it. But so if you really think about it, they're really organizing it first in their thought, and then they organize it in outline. I, for example, had a very interesting revelation. The first year I started writing Farbrengens. So in writing, there's also styles, and I didn't realize. I was writing Farbrengen. I was on the first page. I would spend hours on the first page because I had to visualize the whole thing before I started writing. The first page could take me maybe 15 hours, and then the rest I could knock the whole thing off because I like develop it. So the questions or whatever, the opening page was a critical one for me. So I remember Rabbi once comes in to my office. And I was working with him, but I was writing, and he says, "What are you up to?" So I said, "I'm still on page 1." He says, "What are you doing on page 1?" It's 15 hours. It was like a whole day had passed already. So I said, "How do you write?" So he says, "No, I start writing, and as I go along, and I don't like something, I go back and I fix it and I change it." So I said, "But the idea," he says, "idea starts emerging as I continue writing," and I realized that's two different writing styles. I mean, lack of a better word, I'm more of a visual writer. And he was more of a writer. And I'll be honest, I wish I had sometimes to be able to do that. But by him, he didn't have a place. See, for me, I never went back to page 1. I mean, I went back, but I mean, it was like, it's like I got the summary, and now I develop it. Right. For him, the summary emerged after he developed it, which was fine. He had no problem with throwing out the first page and writing it over.
You start with a mission statement, sort of.
Yeah, so I realized, and yesh b'zeh mashem b'zeh. Mine was much more agonizing. Because I would do research and try to find out every detail of the thing, which means that you're working all in your head without even writing it. And I'd make notes. And by him, it was more, I'm just giving you an example. He would write, he's an excellent writer. And actually, one of his most brilliant parts is he knows how to dissect things into details. Like you hear an idea, he'll right away break it into an outline. It's A, B, C, D, E, A1, A2, A3, B, E, that type of. So there's some people who are very smart, but they don't have organization. Sometimes the same idea can be conveyed, and you don't know what the guy's talking about. Same idea, just change the order, and B, come after A, and it changes. Order is as important as the ideas. How do you convey them? There are people, for example, I hear sometimes people, they mumble off something, and I see that there's some profundity, but they simply are disorganized communicators. So they're telling you Z before A, and then they say, 1 second, And the mind likes to think in terms of, 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, In geometry, you learn this. You have to build a proof. You can't skip steps. Every step has to lead to the next step. So it's organization, which is, it's like more like, how do you create an encyclopedia? How do you, it's very hard to do that. Because when you get an idea, you get it. But when you have to break it down, I think this is somewhat of an example. Like, once you're breaking it down, you're already giving it more oasis, more kalim. And that, of course, organizes the idea much better. Okay. So, so when you're already thinking how to communicate, or you're already thinking letters, Now you sense the letters. So before it was loiner goshim, and now it's goshim. Sometimes this uses the example between water and land. Objects in water are like eishis machshava. Objects on land, which are visible and tangible, are eishis hadibur. So machshava is more like a yam, the sea of thought. It's a sea of ideas that has it has some structure, but it's much more submerged and amorphous. Whereas in speech, you already see tangible letters, and of course in writing, it's even more concrete.
I'm disgusted.
V'zeu kidmusenu, I'm going to discuss on this. V'zeu kidmusenu, tzura b'tzura. And this already is the lower level of thought is the second, is the mus. The tzura, the shape from the shape. Shu tzura nivdalas. The first was tzura atzmis. This is already a tzura shape that's separate. This is like the tzura, the shape in the wax, not in the seal. But nimtza muvon, so we know from this, we know the b'chinas primis hakeli. So we know from this that b'chinas primis hakeli, the inner container, shezo b'chinas b'tzalmenu hu ikre sanctus da'er v'hakeli. That tzalmenu is the primary unity between energy and container. Okay, we're going to go on. Reish Tzadik Beis. V'hine yudua the b'tzalmenu. Now he's going to spell it out in Aveda, and not in Aveda, also in not just Aveda, but also what till now was really Haskalah. I applied it to some things like in Aveda, how Kalim you make air, but now he's going to explain in the context of Yechudi Lo Yechudi Tata. These are two types of unity.
Would you say the one is the development, the idea of matter, and now we're going to examine how it sees itself from matter to matter?
Not necessarily. It's more. This is more explaining what we learn now. How does it manifest in the level of unity, divine unity, the unity of the interface, basically.
And now we're going to look at it and see how we see ourselves, or the object sees itself in relation to where it came from.
You're asking me, or you're telling me?
I'm making this.
I would put it differently. I mean, yes, Aveda means how it applies to us, but Aveda here he's talking about Yechudi Lo Yechudi, how it applies in the big picture. Till now, he was just speaking about the levels. He didn't say what their real role is. Now it's going to be their role and the content function of Yichud. What unity do they create? I said it, but in the Maimer itself, he didn't speak about the unity that they create. They just spoke. Where is what? Tzelem is Tzelem is Primis HaKelim, Chetzenis HaKelim. Now he's going to explain in the context. The word Yichud was not used till now.
Yeah, I know.
Yichud is unity.
Now something new.
It's whatever we learn now, before, is now going to be explained in the context of how it creates divine unity. The Eris HaKelim, Tzelem and Mus. It's known that these two levels, Tzelem and Mus, is the levels of Yichudi Law, higher unity, and Yichudi Tata, lower unity. Yichudi Law liyeshuzeu hadei amitis. Let me explain in a moment. Yichudi Law, Yichudi Tata sometimes is associated with Das Elyon and Das Tachten. So Yichudi Law would be how the